Hey there, welcome, it's time to dive. Kyverno project come alive. Policy engine driving through. Kubernetes, what's this do? Rules and standards keep you safe. Spotlight shines on every case. From the cloud to every node. Kyverno's here, so let's explode. Kyverno, Kyverno. Policy, power you should know. Kyverno, Kyverno. In control everywhere we go. Automate your logic clean. Kubernetes in a dream. From security to design, Kyverno makes it all align.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another Cloud Native Club Project Spotlight series episode. Today I'm excited to have with me Jim Bugwadia from Nirmata Cloud, and we're going to explore Kyverno. So Jim, thanks for joining us. Could you briefly introduce yourself and share what drew you to the Cloud Native space?
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve, for having me, and thanks for that great introduction to the project and song. Like Steve mentioned, I'm Jim Bugwadia, co-founder at Nirmata, also one of the maintainers and a creator of Kyverno. So our journey started in the cloud native space, started pre-Kubernetes in the Docker ecosystem. And at that time, of course, for folks who remember, everyone in the cloud space, I think this was a definition put out by NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology in the US, where they kind of, carved up cloud computing into three layers, right? They talked about it as infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And if you think about it, the infrastructure and the software layers, they evolved fairly quickly. People understood what they are. But as developers and as a software engineer myself, to me, what was always fascinating is that platform as a service layer and what could be done there. So at that time, there were tools like Cloud Foundry, Mesos, others, but it just seemed like something was missing in the space, more needed to be done. And when we saw containers and what, the .cloud team at that time, which eventually became Docker, was doing, we, immediately the light bulbs went off. We saw that was the future, wanted to jump in and, kind of look at containers as packaging for applications, but which of course led to, well, how do you then manage containers at scale, which led to, the evolution of Kubernetes. And we were involved in the space from the beginning, working with, those type of technologies. Initially, we started out as a consulting company working with several large enterprises on their microservices and containerization journey. But then as Kubernetes evolved, we switched completely to product, built some solutions for Kubernetes as part of our experience. And part of that, was policy governance. So I myself come from a telecommunications, network management type of background. I've worked previously in prior lives at with companies like Cisco, Motorola, Lucent, so a lot of networking, both on the voice as well as data networking side. So in those systems, security always tends to be baked into the management plane and control plane. And here, what was always interesting is security was a separate, solution, which was in some cases an afterthought. So what we doubled down on was policy governance. We saw that as a big gap for Kubernetes, and that's what led to the evolution of Kyverno, which is now part of the CNCF.
So could you briefly introduce kind of Kyverno for those who are unfamiliar to it? Can you kind of give it a little kind of elevator pitch of what it is and why we should be using it?
Of course. Yeah, so, as we all might have heard, Kubernetes has a very powerful declarative configuration management system, right? And to parse that a little bit and break it down, declarative configuration means you're declaring the intent, the desired state of what you want the system to be. And the system is responsible for then various controllers in Kubernetes will try to reconcile the current state of the system to the desired state. So in Kubernetes, you can specify a lot of intent, and you can do this at a very fine-grained level. All right, so because Kubernetes addresses such a set of broad use cases, it's necessary for it to be very fine-grained and detailed. And this is where, by the way, I think we've also chatted about, and the question often comes up, well, Kubernetes, it seems complex or is very complex. Well, it is because it does solves a lot of complex problems, right? And, it's fine for, to expose some of that complexity to allow flexibility. So it's a well-intended trade-off as the system is designed. So, but what we're seeing here is because of that declarative configuration, because you have, configuration which is distributed. And the other aspect to remember is Kubernetes might be one of the first, systems which operates across, is really designed for developers, operators, security teams to all be able to collaborate together on it, right? So you have within even something as simple as a deployment or a pod YAML, you have bits and pieces of configuration that security cares about. You have other configuration that maybe the ops team cares about, and other which developers care about. So how do you collaborate across all of this? And that's where we feel policy-based configuration makes a lot of sense. And if you, in the Kubernetes docs, if you pull up the section on policies, what it says is policies are configurations which, which manage other configurations of behaviors. So it's a bit meta, right? So it's kind of configuration which manages configuration, but or behaviors. Yeah, and that's where we felt there was a big gap in the space. We did see, Open Policy Agent was another project in the CNCF, which we're very familiar with. In fact, we tried using it at one point, but really it wasn't designed for the audience, the Kubernetes community. So we felt there's a need for something very native to Kubernetes that operates like a Kubernetes controller, can help manage configurations at scale across developer security and operations, right? So that was the initial motivation for Kyverno.
So it's obviously well known, like you just said, right, in the policy management kind of capability within Kubernetes. So can you highlight some kind of core features that make it really stand out against like something like an open policy agent?
Yes. So first of all, the main draw or the appeal why folks come to Kyverno when they're comparing it, they don't have to learn a complex language like Rego or other kind of obscure languages or ways of doing things. They can get started very easily with the same declarative YAML type of syntax. Now we can argue whether YAML is the best or not, but it's what we have. It's what's in Kubernetes. And if you know how to write a Kubernetes deployment spec, you're going to have to learn some YAML somewhere, right? So our thinking was, look, exactly if folks are spending time investing their time learning Kubernetes, any Kubernetes user should be able to write a Kyverno policy as well. So that's one of the guiding sort of philosophies of the project. But then we also felt that the other need is policies are not just for validation checks, right? Policies can also generate configurations, can mutate configuration. In fact, something very exciting is just-in-time configuration. You might have heard in the security space, people talk about just-in-time permissions. With Kyverno, you can do that for multi-tenancy. You can generate roles, role bindings on the fly, dynamically based on other requests. So if you now marry that with trends like platform engineering and building IDPs, it starts making a lot of sense that you need a comprehensive way of managing configurations, generating, mutating, cleaning up, validating, and that's what Kyverno does best, right? Yeah. The other aspect of it is we also wanted reporting as well as exception management, other workflows to be very native to Kubernetes. So policies don't live in isolation, right? You need all these other lifecycle management tools, and that's what we've spent a lot of time and effort designing and building into Kyverno.
as someone that's had to manage a lot of policies across clusters, I have a lot of questions about that, and I think the audience would really be interested to hear that. So yeah, let's kind of dive into a demo and see what Kyverno is all about.
Absolutely. Yeah, so again, the way we've designed Kyverno is to make it super simple to get started. But let me just kind of share again. I'll start with a couple of slides and then we'll dive in directly into the demo. So what, like we talked about, the way I think of policies, especially in the Kubernetes and cloud native world, they're a contract, right? This is something you want to get your developers, your security, your operations. It's a digital artifact that needs to be signed off on and needs to be agreed to by all stakeholders. And the more policies you have, the better you can automate and manage your systems. Love this, I mean, from a while ago. It's, folks who know Engine and the community operates a lot of cluster. I think he's at Pulumi now.
Yeah.
It's very accurate in terms of what we also see. So as we talked about, again, the goal of Kyverno, how do we prevent misconfigurations, make it simple for security operations to do this? And really, if you think about it, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've made tremendous progress as an industry in automating provisioning, automating configuration for infrastructure, right? Why can't we do the same for security? Why can't we automate, maybe not 100% of security, there'll always be runtime and, projects like Falco and others do that. But why can't we automate this configuration part of it so we don't have to, as developers, we always want to automate ourselves out of a job, right? And so we can do more interesting things. Let's stop wasting time on misconfigurations and leave it to projects like Kyverno.
That's what AI is
to help
right?
it.
So.
Sorry, that's what
I said. That's what AI is going to do now, right? It's going to automate us all out of jobs.
Yes. well, so yeah, if you're for folks who are going to be at KubeCon North America, we're going to launch some tooling on policy management and lifecycle which uses AI. So definitely come back down and see us, but it's still got a long ways to go, right? It's very early days. But there is, of course, there is a lot of potential for what it can do, and it's exciting. So yeah, that's how we kind of went into Kyverno. Just kind of a little bit about the timeline. We created initially, this was a Nirmata project. In fact, it's interesting. A lot of projects, they come, or teams will build them or incubate them either as part of another organization, or first they'll create the open source and then try to build a commercial business on it. We had a successful commercial business, and Kyverno was part of that, but it was not called Kyverno at that time. It was just a module in Nirmata. But we, saw the need for it in the space. We saw how much our customers loved it. So we spun that out, built it in as an admission controller, donated to CNCF, and we're on the cusp of graduation from CNCF, which we're super excited about and
awesome.
looking forward to. Yeah. So the key use cases we see, going to your point, is starting with pod security, right? So it's interesting, and there's some studies and research papers out on this. There's a ton of clusters out there. There's something like 40 to 60%, if I recall correctly, which one of the Aqua Security, or one of the security companies that published a report, which are running without basic pod security, right? And it's a bit shocking when you think about what kind of workloads and how many businesses are using Kubernetes, and they don't have this in place, right? And there's this thinking. Even I was talking to a company which was building a networking security product, so they themselves are in a security space, and their initial take was, hey, we're okay because we don't expose our clusters publicly. We don't, you can't, right? So it's like we everything's under our firewall. Oh, it's managed by our CI/CD pipeline, so we're good.
We're secure.
And it's like, right. And I was like, okay, I guess you missed the last four KubeCons where, you know, there's pretty much like for at least like 4 or 5 years, every KubeCon, there would be a session from folks like Ian Coldwater and, you know, Rory McCune and several other security experts who would show so many ways of breaking out of containers, right? Which but still, maybe in our kind of ecosystem and bubble, we feel that's a very well-known fact. But there's plenty of production workloads out there without even that basic layer. And pods are just the beginning. There's a starting point of a workload in Kubernetes, right? You have things like, you know, services, and you have deployments, and you have stateful sets, and then you might add a service mesh, whether it's Istio or Linkerd, and you might, if you're running AI ML, you might be using Ray. All of these things have security, you know, best practices. If you go to the Istio docs, there's about 80, you know, checks that they talk about saying, hey, these are best practices. But how do you codify those? How do you implement those? How do you know you're compliant, right?
Yeah.
That's what Kyverno does. And we have the ability to quickly, you know, either you write your custom policies, you start within the community. We have something like about, I think, at least over 200. Let me check. If you go to our policy tab, 354 sample policies to pick from, right?
Wow.
And growing, right? So
That'll get
across,
started.
yes, these are, you know, of course, some of these are, and these come from contributions from other vendors, other projects. But there's everything from, you know, like starting with the basics of pod security to, if you're using things like Valero, you can go back and say, okay, how do I generate, you know, this is a way to kind of mutate things to back up volumes within a container, right? So plenty of examples to get started
So is this like a
and get going.
marketplace, Jim?
Not well, it's open source, right? So it's free for anybody to contribute. We try to, you know, as you'll see some vendor names here, but so it's open for anybody to contribute sample policies. Of course, there are some, you know, best practices and standards that we will go through. We inspect, but it's very easy to kind of get you know, some samples in here. Regardless of which, like, you know, I think you, when we were chatting, you mentioned you're a Flux maintainer. The Flux project uses, you know, Kyverno for some multi-tenancy constructs. There's other, you know, best practice policies here as well, right? So some interesting things you can do with any project. But yeah, so going back to kind of Kyverno and some of the use cases. So starting with some of those basics, but then even going into, you know, the power of Kyverno is when you start combining validation with mutation and generation and cleanup, then you get to some very interesting workflows, right?
Mm-hmm.
So multi-tenancy is a very, you know, in Kubernetes, as everyone probably should know, you know, tenancy is built on top of namespaces. Namespaces are a very basic building block, but even with namespaces, by default, every you know, namespace can talk to any other namespace within the cluster. If you're not properly configuring your quotas, your limit ranges, things like that, one noisy neighbor can impact others. So I used to contribute to the multi-tenancy working group in CNCF as well. And we did a lot of work to help define multi-tenancy, help, you know, understand the different models of namespaces as a service, clusters as a service, or, you know, hosted control planes or control planes as a service. What are the difference? How do you isolate? How do you segment? So Kyverno helps with a lot of those too, and works very well with other tools like vCluster and others in the space, right? And then there's resource management. So recently there was a great blog post by the platform team at Adidas where they talked about how using Kyverno and VPA, they were able to cut costs by about 50% on dev test clusters, right? And you can apply the same best practices in production, but you might want to kind of alert and inform versus just, you know, change workloads, which they were comfortable doing in dev test or lower environments. And then supply chain security tends to typically be a very, you know, important use case. We've all heard about attacks like SolarWinds and others. So Kyverno does a great job of being able to verify whether you're signing with Sigstore cosign, or if you're signing with Notary, which is another CNCF project. Kyverno can verify for the right image signatures, attestations before admitting anything into production. You can also, by the way, mutate existing workloads, verify existing workloads. There's a CLI, which I'll show in the demo, which you can use for a lot of things. So pretty full-featured for comprehensive policy as code management. And by the way, one other thing to quickly mention, as much as Kyverno, and I'll go into policy details, etc., but I just want to kind of highlight this. A lot of folks still think about Kyverno as something for Kubernetes only. But about 8 months ago, we launched a project called Kyverno JSON, which is now a sub-project of Kyverno, and is also aligned with the future of our policy engine, where you can apply Kyverno to any workload, right? So in fact, at Nirmata, where we provide multiple commercial solutions on top of Kyverno, we have a Terraform, analyzer. You can, so you can apply Kyverno policies to Terraform or other, like even AWS CDK or Ansible or anything you can convert to JSON at any layer in your stack, whether it's infrastructure, application,
Yeah, I was
etc.
gonna.
Right?
It's interesting you actually display this because I was gonna ask you a question later on about Chainsaw. So yeah, I'll start with
Yes.
that.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that project as well. And it was emerged out of a need that we had. And some of the best tooling, of course, we know always comes about from a itch we need to scratch ourselves. And then, kind of evolves into a bigger and brighter project. So pretty interesting stuff going on there as well. Yeah, so let's take a quick look at what a policy looks like in Kyverno, or and how Kyverno operates on policies, right? So first off, just in terms of architecture, Kyverno runs as an admission controller. That's the most common form factor, but you can also run it as a CLI. It also runs in the background, so post admission controls, right? So if you want to change existing resources or validate existing resources, all of that is possible, because it's very common. You'll have, at this point with the widespread use of Kubernetes, you're going to have workloads in production, and then you roll out a policy. The policy can't just apply at admission controls, right? So one question we get often is, how does Kyverno, now that we have validating admission policy, how does it compare? Where should I use Kyverno, and when should I use validating admission policy? And it's a fair question. And we love, by the way, we feel that, partly we have validating admission policy because of what Kyverno, and it's interesting to see the evolution in the space. OPA kind of proved the need for a policy. It defined the use cases. Kyverno came along and, made them simpler, made them native to Kubernetes, made them better. And validating admission policy is the next evolution, which even makes it more able to execute right in the Kubernetes API server itself.
Yeah.
However,
it's always
go
interesting, right,
ahead.
when you think about it, because it's a problem that I've experienced previously, which is like you can run policy when you're like, I talk about three phases, right? You've got the pre-deployment to Kubernetes, like at the gate of
Yep.
Kubernetes, and then like post-deployment. So everyone's
Yep.
like, oh, well, Kyverno or any policy management system will sit like at the gate to Kubernetes and be like the kind of bouncer that will stop you from being able to deploy into Kubernetes. But there's so many workloads that are currently running. Like, how do you make sure
Right.
that you can get an understanding of how, how compliant they are against your policy suite is always a challenge, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's the reality. So when you think about policy management, you can't just have something that works at admission controls and ignore existing workloads, or the fact that policies change. Just like if you're really, policy as code means just like code evolves, policies evolve. So now if you have a V2 version, you want to reapply it to existing workloads, right? So you can't just say that will apply for new changes and everything else should be ignored, because that might end up being insecure again or lead to other problems. So we've spent quite a lot of time thinking through these problems and the lifecycle management of policies at Nirmata, and of course within the Kyverno project with the community. We have great other, maintainers from companies like Giant Swarm, working with other partners like even Infosys and others who are building maintainer or, contributing to the project at this point. So, but, going back on that lifecycle management, yeah, so with validating admission policies, you can apply them at admission controls. But if you need something that applies them in your pipelines, as well as applies them in the background, Kyverno does that. So Kyverno, being native or designed for Kubernetes, it adopts Kubernetes constructs 100%, and extends and enriches them wherever possible, right? So we do support validating admission policies now with like at release 111 and 112 of Kyverno. And Kyverno can automatically, if you define a Kyverno policy, which can be converted to a validating admission policy, it'll automatically do that and run it in the API server. So you get the best of both, but you also get, background scanning, and you get CLIs, which can be applied, and you get reporting, and you get exception management, which is all of these things are needed, right? Because without that, you can't manage this in a real production type environment.
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions that I have as well. Like, right, when you start to get to a certain type of scale, policy management becomes either incredibly easy or incredibly difficult, depending upon how you've kind of configured it up front. But we can kind of go into that later on.
Absolutely, yeah. Happy to. Yeah, so just in terms of the policy rule itself, and we'll look at some examples. So a policy in Kyverno is a Kubernetes resource, right? So it has, each policy can contain multiple rules. Rules can either match, exclude resources. There's a lot of flexibility on that. And you can do this by kinds, by labels, annotations, the user or groups, service accounts, so several different ways to match, exclude, and combine this in however you wish. And then once you have decided that policy, or once the engine decides the policy applies, it will either execute a validation check, mutation generation, or image verification, right? And you can then, of course, have multiple policies. Policies are designed to be fully just like with transactions, they're idempotent, where one policy cannot override or influence another, because that could be a security problem if an attacker is able to kind of create policies which override other policies, right? So each policy will be enforced separately. But then, Kyverno will process the results of all of this, send it back to the API server if you're running in admission control mode. If you're in background scanning mode, a report will be created and applied, right? So that's the basics of how it works. And very simple to do, both as admission controls and as well as, kind of through scanning or just on a cluster. So I'll start with we can switch to a demo. And what I'll do is let me hide this for now. And we'll just start with what a simple scan looks like. And I guess you already, let's see, whoops, didn't mean to. Let's exit out of this guy. Yeah, so here I have a cluster. If I look at the namespaces, I just spun up this kind cluster. Kyverno is not installed. Now I'm going to use the Nirmata CLI. It is the Kyverno CLI underneath it with a few more bells and whistles on reporting, etc. And it has the ability to publish reports, things like that. But just to show an example of what this looks like, I was able to scan my cluster, see a quick report, of what exactly is compliant and is not compliant. So it shows me, imagine you could run this in your pipelines. You could quickly scan existing, like if somebody changes a manifest, you can apply that to it. You see which rules passed, which failed. If you want details, it shows you all of that. And of course, all of this can get pushed into tooling of your choice. So this, by the way, this report standard in the policy working group in Kubernetes, we have made this, a standard report across the other projects. It's not just limited to Kyverno. So you can, then there's plugins already available for Falco, for Trivi, for other things, right? So the advantage here is you get an open reporting standard where anybody can report, issues and manage issues at scale. and Kyverno uses that for Kubernetes as well.
Yeah, I'm glad they did this. It's made life so much easier, especially when you want to try and go with the kind of single pane of glass view, right? You can consume all of this data together and it all looks and kind of feels the same. And then it just kind of is a presentation problem rather than a let me try and standardize it on actual
Exactly.
input. So yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah, no, and that leads to some very powerful kind of things. And I'll just showcase very, quickly. If you, as you said, once you kind of tie it all together, what you can start doing is across clusters, pipelines, repos, and you could have like even CIS benchmarks running. It gives you a lot of, then ability to manage this at scale across different tools. And this is what, again, solutions like Nirmata or OpenShift also started, using the same policy report format. Others can do on top. So lots of interesting things that can be built once you have that foundational layer. And you can plug in your own custom scanner if you wish and get reports, which some of our customers end up doing, right? So pretty interesting. All right, so let's go back to this and taking it. So that was without me installing anything, right? But of course, if I'm running in production, we will want to install something and run admission controls. So as you saw in right now, I don't have anything. So let's actually go ahead and install Kyverno and see how easy that is to go from completely insecure to secure. By the way, this is a cool demo. Duffy Cooley, who's now at Isovalent, he came up, he showed me this, but I think others have shown this also at KubeCon. If you, let's say, do this one
Yes.
single command line, have you seen this?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty slick, right? So what it does, and let's actually back up a little bit, right? So if I, here in my command line, if I say, who am I? I'm myself, right? I'm not a privileged user. I'm not root. And if I kind of do where I am, I'm in my Kyverno demo repo. So right now, I'm running as a non-privileged user in a specific directory. But now if I run that kubectl command we were looking at, what's super interesting is just with this single command, what's happening is it's running as a privileged container, and it's running nsenter and then mounting the proc directory. So if we run this and if it's allowed in my cluster, basically if this goes as planned, what it should do is I'll end up being root on my system. And at that point, I have access to my host. I have access. I can do lateral movement, go anywhere, read anything, right? Seems like it's taking a bit to pull this.
It's definitely the best kubectl one-liner, in my opinion. Like I've
Right.
used it in a bunch of places. Like when I was doing some security audits previously, I just used to run this one-line
Yep.
command, and I was like, if this is allowed, by the way, this is terrible, and we can fix it.
Yes.
But they're like, oh, you can do all this in one line. So you look like elite because you can do it in one line, and then you tell them what you've done.
Right.
It's like double impressed in one kubectl command. It's impressive.
Yeah. So Duffy actually has some stickers for this, so he usually gives them out at the Cilium booth.
He does.
It's good to spread the word and make sure everybody understands the security model in Kubernetes. And look, I mean, maybe attackers don't have kubectl access, but if they have access to an application, again, they can, as long as they break out of a container, then they can access other aspects of it and do the similar kind of escapes, right? So to prevent against that, you need tools like Kyverno or, again, other admission controllers or some way of managing pod security admission, right? And so if we go back to let's just install Kyverno and see what happens. I'm going to go with the latest release. So I'll just pull latest here. We are, by the way, prepping, 1.13 will be our release coming out. And if I install Kyverno at this point, it runs a bunch of stuff. It installs CRDs. And if I go back to, my namespace, what I'm seeing is there's a Kyverno namespace. if I do -n Kyverno and let's see what's running in there.
There's nothing wrong with randomly applying YAML off the internet.
Yeah, well, so this is, you can, of course, use a Helm chart, you can use signed YAMLs, there's our images are signed, there's an SBOM. So there's lots of security best practices, but for demos, I always fall back to YAMLs, right? Yeah, so if I look at my deployment options here, I'll see there's an admission controller, there's a background controller, a cleanup controller, and a reports controller, right? So at this point, I already have Kyverno installed. Looks like it's still fetching that image. Something's low on my machine, so we'll give it some time. But at this point, I don't have any policy, so I'm free to run. Like if I, run, let's say run Nginx, and I just want to run a pod, it can run, in, like in my default namespace, it'll create the pod and it'll pull the YAML and run, right? So obviously that's not great. We want to, do a little bit better than that. So what I'm gonna, and even like that insecure pod that we looked at with the one-liner, I'm able to run that. So now I'm gonna apply some Kyverno policies, and just here what I'm doing is I'm using customize. I'm going to the Kyverno public pod security library. I'm gonna get the restricted policies from there. Again, we also have a Helm chart for this. You can, either fork the repo and customize it yourself, or you can use our upstream. But I'm going to apply these policies into my cluster itself, and then we'll see what happens if I try to run Nginx again. And we should also see a report show up for the pod we were able to run earlier, right? So now if I do kubectl, let's say get cpol, which is cluster policy, what I should see is there's a bunch of policies installed, and these policies are they have background true, admission true, so they apply at admission, they apply at background. I want to double check and see if these policies are in enforce mode, or I don't recall if I said.
Is npol the namespace policy by any chance?
No, it's just POL or just policy. Yeah. Yeah, so let me actually put these in enforce mode, right? So what I realized was I put the restricted policy set, but I did not apply them in enforce mode, which means that they will just audit and produce reports, but they won't block workloads if a malicious workload or a bad workload is tried to be run on the cluster. So now we can go back. We should still see the same policies. If I look at one of these policies, let's take a quick look. And these are all cluster level policies, so they're going to apply to all pods, all namespaces, right?
One for your feature roadmap is like, it would be cool to see what mode it's in when you list.
We used to have that in the CLI, and I think it's still available with -o wide. But because you can have mutate and generate policies, and that it doesn't apply to those.
Yeah, that makes
we
sense.
removed it from the default. Yeah. So a few things here which are interesting, right? So first of all, I can see this policy. I just applied a simple pod level policy, but Kyverno automatically generated policy rules for me for deployments, for also other like stateful sets, daemon sets, other pod controllers, right? So that I can see, and if I look at the status block of my policy, I'm able to, let's actually just pull this up in an editor so we can look at it better. And this is just a policy to.
I didn't know that it did that. So you're saying so I've deployed a policy that's targeting my pods, and because you know that pods are part of other types of resources, it's automatically created them for those as well?
Yes.
Smart.
Because awesome. it understands that, again, since you're running in Kubernetes, and in this case, there are different default pod controllers. So see here in status autogen, it created a rule which matches all of these controllers, including replica sets. Because what we have seen, and in fact, there's some interesting security audits we have gone through, where if you don't do this, then there's various ways to bypass, or if you just target a deployment and not a pod, I mean, you have to do it for defensive depth at every layer, right? So deployment, replica set, and pod need to be also all checked. So this AutoGen automatically created it for this, and then for jobs and cron jobs, there's also another way. It'll create separate rules for that, right? And these we put in the status block because they're not part of your policy. You might want to manage through GitOps, but they're automatically generated, and you can control all of this, right? So you can go back and kind of make it turn it off, or even if you have custom pod controllers that you're using, and a few other projects have their own custom controllers, like pod controllers, you can apply it to that, right? So, which is very cool. So, yeah. So now let's actually try and see, make sure it works, right? So I'm gonna create, let's say I want to create a deployment. So I'll create a deployment Nginx instead of running the pod Nginx like we did before, and we'll just dry run it and see what happens, right? So at this point, Kyverno immediately blocks and says you got to drop capabilities, you got to run as non-root, and these are all pod security standards, right? This is not checks we came up with. This is what Kubernetes prescribes for any workload. If you want the restricted level of pod security, and of course you can customize this as you wish. But that's just the basics of what again you can do here, and it's showing you exactly where it failed, what failed, and this is also going to be available. So if you do, let me see if policy reports showed up yet. Yes, they did. So I can see reports for all my existing workloads, including the ones which should not have run, right? And by default, it covers every namespace, but you can turn this off.
Do you flush after a period of time, Jim? Like, obviously, like the amount of data that this could produce could be vast. So is there like a kind of retention period in terms of like numbers of reports that you keep before? Do you just kind of trim the fat from the bottom?
Great. Yeah, great point. So it's only the current report, right? Any offline, any history has to be done by, higher level tools, control plane or management plane tools, like, whether it's Nirmata or OpenShift or any other tool that you're using for policy governance management. But in the cluster, it will keep only the current. Okay. Even that can be a challenge, right? So we have seen one of the biggest problems we've had with Kyverno and extremely large clusters, or even if your cluster is not that large, but it's very noisy. Like there's a lot of traffic going through the API server. Maybe you have a dev test cluster where there's jobs which are constantly failing, things which haven't been cleaned up. Kyverno gets hammered quite a bit in terms of requests, and then if you're generating reports on all of this, it can add up, right? So with Kyverno 1.11 and 1.12, you can offload all of this using API aggregation. So Kyverno now supports an etcd offload, and that is a dramatic improvement in performance, and as well, because your etcd is not as overly loaded. And etcd, as you probably know, is by default, I think it comes, it's like either 2 or 4 GB, and then you can size it up to 8 GB max for Kubernetes. So if you have like thousands of namespaces, the reports can add up, right? So that's something we work, of course, with customers very closely on, and make sure that this is running correctly. And the recommendation is to offload etcd into a report aggregation layer. So you get the full value of reporting and visibility, but at the same time, you're not kind of impacting other etcd. Yeah. So and just kind of also to show, in addition to that, we also kind of generate events. So by the way, events went through the same life cycle. Its events were initially etcd resource. They still are a Kubernetes resource, but now by default, most managed Kubernetes services will run them in an offload mode. So you're not overloading etcd with this, right? But yeah, you can pick up, so developers can also see their own policy violations. If you're running Argo CD or Flux, these tools will also pick up policy reports and show them if there's UIs, both of which have UIs for them. You'll see them attached to the right resources. So the goal again is to have very simple visibility for developers, for operators, for these teams.
I think we may have lost you, Jim. I think we may have lost Jim there. Oh,
sorry, yeah, it seems like I lost my network, but I'm back.
Classic live stream.
Yes. Yeah, so I was mentioning policy exceptions. So exceptions, by the way, will be GA in 1.13. The idea is that you can, now going back to the lifecycle management, the goal is to get policies to an enforce mode as much as possible.
Yep.
But to go to enforce, you are going to have exceptions, right? So one common request was, how do I manage this at scale? What can I do? So with Kyverno now, you can generate an exception. It's a separate resource. And you can say, I want an exception for pods or deployments, and be very granular. You can say, I want it for specific rules, or an entire policy, along with conditions. You can even select which image you want an exception for policies which apply, at an image level or container level, right? So like for pod security, that becomes critical. You might want to say that, hey, I want to give an exception to only Istio images which run as a sidecar and have, additional privileges. But if any other sidecar in that namespace, I'm not going to allow additional permissions or privileges, right?
Yeah, these are always the caveats, right? There's always the things that we've got to let go, like the exceptions. So yeah, having that as a first class resource makes a ton of sense. And yeah, if you're saying it's going GA in the next release, that's great to see.
Yeah, and this works extremely well with GitOps too. So a lot of our customers use this with the GitOps workflow. You can manage exceptions in a separate repo or with your app repo, depending on how you want to deploy. And then you can approve. So Git can become your source of truth, where you can have approvals and exceptions from security. Of course, like again, commercial tools provide a bunch of other workflows and integrations and other bells and whistles. But to get started, this works really well. And then, basically once this resource is configured, then you can, go ahead and deploy, even if the policy is in enforce mode. So then in the report, it will show up as a skipped rule instead of just blocking or as a failure, etc. Yeah, so that's a quick demo on some
great.
of the.
Thanks, Jim.
I know you said you had a bunch of questions, but we would love to dig in. And there's several other things we can go through. Again, there's many use cases we see Kyverno for. Everything from cost optimization to like security and signing verification, things like that.
So let's start with the previous guest's question. So if you're aware, we have this tradition on the show where the previous guest leaves a question for the next guest, and it could literally be about anything. So Lewis from Madeira asked, where did you start off on your cloud native journey with minimal knowledge, and kind of what tools and techniques did you use to improve that area of weakness?
So yeah, thinking back, and certainly like everybody else, like if you rewind back, about 10 years or so, like I had no knowledge of Kubernetes, of course, at that time when it was just emerging, as well as containers were very new, right? So I was more familiar with traditional virtualization, VM based, not so much with process based virtualization and containers. But certainly the amazing thing about the community, as well as all of the information that the community manages and puts out, and the great projects, was just diving in, trying things out, playing and experimenting, right? Was our learning and journey.
It's the best way.
And yeah, and initially, I know a lot of folks go through this too. So just even for me, like I come more from an enterprise background than an open source background, right? So to me, also getting involved in open source projects, getting involved in the community, like the CNCF community, it took a little bit of, sort of dipping your toes in the water and figuring out what is this, what should I do? Because the first time I joined a CNCF meeting, it was quite unusual. You have all these people from different companies. You don't know whether how you're expected to behave or what you should say, or if you should say anything. And all of those options are perfectly fine, right? And I found CNCF as a very welcoming community. Even with the Kyverno project, we welcome anybody to just join in and listen into our community meetings. You don't have to say anything, do anything. If you're, feel comfortable enough introducing yourself, we love that. Whether you're an end user, somebody looking to just learn about Kyverno, just join a meeting and see how it goes, right? And really, that's all it takes. And then a few of those, you get comfortable enough to start speaking up, start, giving opinions. So for me, the journey was starting just by attending some SIG security and tag security and SIGOT meetings and learning, right? And listening in and understanding what issues mattered, what they didn't. And then eventually I had enough confidence to start, participating and becoming, more visible in those meetings and projects, and which led to, me taking on co-chair roles in certain projects like the policy working group, as well as the multi-tenancy working group, which, by the way, we've since wound down because we felt we had done everything the working group was set out to do. So yeah, that was the start.
So one from me, and again, Lewis, thanks for the question. So as Kubernetes kind of continues to evolve, right? There's a new release, every other minute essentially. What do you see as kind of the biggest challenge in maintaining and adapting Kyverno to kind of keep pace with this ecosystem that's constantly moving?
Yes. So I think what we tend to want to do more with Kyverno is build collaborations with other projects, like whether they're Flux or Argo CD, or even, just looking in now with all of the excitement around AI ML workloads as projects like Q and Ray and Kubre. Kyverno has broad applicability with all of these, right? So at this point, we feel that the project itself is reaching a good point of maturity. We are doubling down on Cell, which is the language that validating admission policy uses as our native language, and already have very strong support for it. So what we're shifting towards is more integrations, collaboration, other use cases in the community itself, right? So I feel that's where we would like to focus more and kind of go in that direction. So there's some fascinating things happening. It's always amazing to see all the innovation, like you said, but it's fast moving. And not everybody, again, we might feel that everybody knows Kyverno, but the majority of Kubernetes users still might never have not heard about it, right? So
yeah, I think there's so many projects in the CNCF landscape, right? There's bound to be hundreds that people haven't heard of necessarily. So this is one of the reasons why we put this series together, is to kind of spotlight, the more well-known projects, but also the less known projects that are just on their way, to being even incubated. That's the whole idea and premise behind this. So kind of looking forward, what exciting developments or plans can we expect from Kyverno? Obviously, without spoiling the whole entire roadmap in one sentence.
No, so we will be announcing a few things around KubeCon. I already mentioned, as Kubernetes evolves, our philosophy, our approach is to be as native and as Kubernetes focused as possible. But we do see the wide use cases for Kyverno outside of Kubernetes too. So we're going to be doing more work there. You mentioned Chainsaw earlier, so we're pretty excited about how Kyverno is changing the game. And if you haven't tried this, you should. If you're running any application, anything in Kubernetes, Chainsaw can add some behavioral tests in a very easy, low-code, no-code manner to test your applications in your CI pipelines. and we use that extensively now in Kyverno itself. So it's battle tested, hardened, and ready for use. Several other controllers and projects are using it.
It's cool. I actually want to get you or one of the team on to specifically talk about Chainsaw because I think it deserves its own spotlight because it's such an impressive tool. And
Absolutely,
yeah, for those of you who
absolutely.
are not familiar with it, you should go check it out because I actually think it's going to be game changing moving forward. But I won't
Yeah.
spoil it.
Yeah, and I know just the person, Shaladwa, who's on the Kyverno, he's a Kyverno maintainer and one of the key contributors. He created Chainsaw, so I know he'd love to talk more about it. So certainly I'll send you his details.
Yeah, let's do it. And then, as someone that's kind of deeply involved in the cloud native community, like you are, kind of what advice would you give someone that's looking to contribute to a project like Kyverno?
So I think, like I was mentioning before, get the hardest part, and I think there's a saying which which talks about it. The most difficult part is taking that first step, right? And just getting started, showing up is like 50% of it, right? And look, all of us are learning, all of us are growing at this point, even for Kyverno. I mean, it's interesting. I remember, like, myself in shooting, who was also one of our maintainers, we're both involved from the beginning, right? So I remember like the initial commits in Kyverno, and at that time, both the two of us at least knew the project quite well, all of the code in it. At this point, it's too big where any one of us, like Kubernetes, you can't claim to be an expert in every area. You have to pick your area and stick to it.
Who has
So
the
I
first
think
commit?
I think
Do
it
you know?
was me, yeah,
So
but
you're the Joe Vader of
uh,
Kyverno. Congrats.
uh, yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah. So, yeah, but I think at this point I can't claim to know all of Kyverno. There's others like we talked about, Shalava shooting. There's also Vishal, Mariam, Khalid, who are all great contributors to the project, and they've taken it, several levels beyond. Where I'm not even a reviewer in all areas of the project. So for new folks, just join our meeting. By the way, we're constantly welcoming new maintainers. So if folks are interested in becoming project maintainers, seeing what that experience is like, it does take some commitment and learning and effort, but we're here to help along that journey.
Yeah, and I'll make sure that I put all of that information in the episode description as well, so that people can get a hold of that. So obviously, as you're
Awesome.
aware, we have this tradition. So what question do you want to leave for the next guest? And it'll be the next guest on the project spotlight. So you can't jump and try and get Joe. Um, but it could be anything. It could be about their project. It could be about them personally. It could be about their journey. Nothing's kind of off the table.
Okay. Oh, what is the next project and who's the next person?
So next project will be announced imminently. So I'm not going to kind of spoil it.
Oh,
But
okay. Okay.
it's in the security space. Let's put it that way.
Um, yeah, security is a pretty broad topic. Any other, like, is it more runtime? Is it
Yeah,
static?
let's without giving it away, let's call it runtime security.
Okay. Yeah, so just how do they feel security is evolving to meet the needs of cloud native?
Okay. Cool. And yeah, with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thanks so much, Jim, for coming and joining us today and sharing your insights into Kyverno. It's an awesome project. I've used it previously. Some of the things that you showed me, I wasn't aware of. Some of them I was, which is great for me personally, and I think great for the community in general. Yeah, and don't forget to check out Kyverno at kyverno.io and stay connected with the Cloud Native Club on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And until next time, everyone, stay Cloud Native. Thanks.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.